Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Barely Qualified Picks. Just ahead of our actual episode today, I wanted to let everybody know that we were intending to cover the Pro Football Hall of Fame nominees, our projected finalists, and who we think are the inductees for the 2026 class of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. We thought we were going to do that all in one episode. Ended up taking a lot more time than we expected. So we're breaking that up into two episodes. We're going to bring you episode one today with all of our offensive players. We're going to whittle that down to two offensive inductees that we think are going to be the choice by the selection committee when it all is said and done. And then in our second episode, which we'll be releasing hopefully within the next 24 hours, we're going to get you the defenders and who we think are going to fill out the 6 slots that we have left for finalists in 2026. And then ultimately, who we think the two choices will be for defensive players to be inducted into the 2026 Hall of Fame class. Thanks again. Really appreciate you guys listening. And now, on to the show. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Barely Qualified Picks. I'm excited to be back with you guys today to talk about the Pro Football Hall of Fame, the 2026 class, and here to do it with my brother, John Ceccarelli, who has some thoughts about this year's nominees, who will make the final 15, and then ultimately, who will get inducted into the class of 2026. John, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Really excited for the chat today.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just to give everybody an idea of how we're going to go about this, we're going to start by talking a little bit just about how players get on this list. There are 128 players who have been nominated for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Ultimately, the class of 2026 is going to be somewhere between 3 and 5 people. For our purposes, I'm going to assume that we're going to get 4 inductees, and they're going to be evenly split on the offensive and defensive side of the ball. I'm sorry, special teamers. I'm just going to say it right now. You're not getting in if you're special team only on my top 4 ballot.
You're not a
But
big Josh Cribbs fan?
you know what? I do love Josh Cribbs. I just don't think the Hall of Fame is the right place for Josh Cribbs. I think we need to look back at last year. Obviously, there's some big names last year. So we'll do that. And then we'll go through the position groups. We'll look at each group of guys that are in there. We'll flag the first time nominees who've made it on the Hall of Fame ballot for the first time this year. And then we're going to go ahead and say who we think our 11 would be. Just as a reminder, this 128 has got to get whittled down to 15 finalists, and 4 of those spots are already locked up by guys who made the top 7 of the class of 2025 voting. So Willie Anderson in there. Torrey Holt, Rams wide receiver, in there. Luke Kuechly, superstar, do-everything middle linebacker for the Panthers, in there. Adam Vinatieri, in there. So those 4 spots are locked up. John, what we've got to do is we've got to figure out who do we think our 11 would be if we had a magic wand and it was a vote of 1. But then also, let's try and forecast who the voters are going to select. Any thoughts before we take everybody through how this whole sausage gets made?
This process makes me feel really old and really young at the same time. And let me just start by saying Adrian Peterson, not eligible because he hasn't been retired for 5 years yet, which is mind-blowing for a running back that has had catastrophic knee injuries. But he was an Ironman. The other thing, we mentioned Luke Kuechly. He's younger than me, and that makes me feel really old. And the last point that I'll have, Todd Gurley is now 5 years retired. That dude's 30. And so it's just kind of wild to think about the impact he had on those Rams teams, and then just how catastrophic that degenerative knee injury was.
Well, and Todd Gurley came into the league, if I recall correctly, off of a knee injury. And so it was sort of like Brandon Roy in the NBA when he was drafted by the Blazers. A lot of people thought he might be the very best player in this entire draft. He might be an NBA Hall of Fame type talent, but he's got no cartilage in his knee, which is a problem. And Todd Gurley, obviously had the knee injuries. And to your point, these NFL career arcs, they're just so variable, and there's so many factors in play that can have a star burn out very brightly, or, in some cases, like in Adrian Peterson, you just have the right build and you can play seemingly almost forever. So getting back to it, we've got a selection committee. This is a 50-person selection committee. They're looking at, a broad list of nominees. Lots of guys can get nominated, but ultimately the selection committee is going to take this broad range of guys who are getting nominated across the league. To your point, have to be retired for 5 years. Keep me honest, I don't think there's another hard requirement for it. It's just the 5 years.
Just the 5 years. Now, one thing that is curious to me, Bill Belichick is also up for the Hall of Fame, I believe, because coaches only have that 3-year requirement. Just a fun hypothetical. North Carolina not looking great right now. If Bill somehow got inducted this year and then came back to coaching, what happens there?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think like coaching is the one area where you can be a Hall of Famer, because you could already be in the Hall of Fame as a player and then become a coach. And so then you're a Hall of Famer who is coaching. Why are we splitting hairs, right? Like, what's the difference between being a Hall of Fame coach? Bill Belichick is the greatest coach of all time. I don't think anybody would really argue that. There have been a lot of great coaches. I think of the Bill Walshes of the world and even the Andy Reids. Lots of great coaches. But Bill Belichick is an all-timer. I think we can agree that if there are coaches in the Hall of Fame, he's in the Hall of Fame. So I don't really get bothered by that. But I do think it's interesting that he's going into the Hall of Fame as North Carolina is going through what they're going through, Bill and his son Steve. So we've got this selection committee. They're going to whittle this big list of guys down to 50, and then from 50 they're going to get it down to the 15. As we mentioned, 4 of those spots are already locked up, so they've got to figure out the other 11. And then from there, the selection committee is ultimately going to decide on who gets inducted into the class of 2026. And that could consist of anywhere from 3 to 5 players. As I mentioned, we're going to assume that it's a 4-player class. And I'm really excited to go through these with you and figure out who the 11 are. There are a lot of really interesting talents at each position. Just to go back before we go forward, last year we had 4 players that were nominated. Eric Allen, Jared Allen, Antonio Gates, and Sterling Sharp. So we had kind of 2 players from the 80s and 90s, 2 players from the aughts, and then into the 2010s in Gates and Jared Allen. I really can't argue with any of those guys. I mean, truly, by the time you get down to 4, when you look at this list, it's pretty unassailable that they are deserving. Are they more deserving than the other 128 or 124 guys or whatever it is on the list? Yeah, that gets a little bit more difficult to say, but I think we will get to a 4 that nobody can question deserve their spot in the Hall should they get it. All right, John, let's start with the quarterbacks. This year, we had 3 quarterbacks who were nominated for the first time, which is tops among positions. Who were they?
Drew Brees, Phillip Rivers, and Alex Smith.
Yeah. Okay, so before we get into everybody else, let's just talk first-timers. I mean, Drew Brees is obviously number 1 of these 3, right?
He's got to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. I mean, when you look at kind of 3 aspects here. 1, he has a ring, and then it ties into kind of the second aspect of narrative. I do feel like narrative plays a big part, especially for dudes like Drew Brees, where he came into the league a little bit undersized. He was one of those first kind of smaller quarterbacks, and then, he had the shoulder injury, if I remember correctly, in San Diego, and was kind of chased out by Phillip Rivers, somebody we're going to talk about, and then he went to New Orleans and took them from the Aints and this bottom-dwelling team to being something incredible in the aftermath of Katrina. And I think we all remember that Super Bowl trading blows where it was a 13-0 versus a 13-0, both finished 13-3 team, and he took it to Peyton Manning's Colts that year and then brought them their only title. That's not even to mention.
Your point, he brought them that title. It wasn't like, hey, we're Seahawks fans. Russell Wilson has a ring. And it's not to say that Russell Wilson wasn't a very important player that year, that he wasn't a very important player during that playoff run. But Russell Wilson didn't win that championship. The Legion of Boom won that championship. Marshawn Lynch won that championship. And to your point, for New Orleans, without Drew Brees, they don't even sniff a championship. And now you see Sean Payton trying to do it all over again in Denver with Bo Nix. But I agree with you. He's got a ring, and he's the reason he's got a ring. That counts for something.
And you look at the stats, because we can pull that up, and then you have the Eli Manning argument of he was super hot during those 2 playoff runs, and yes, he had a great defense, but with Drew Brees,
I mean,
he
Brees threatened the all-time passing record.
That's exactly what I was going to get to.
He was not like a 3 or 4 great. He did it and did it and did it and did it, and he did it behind great offensive lines and not great offensive lines and big offensive lines for being a guy who was like 6 foot on the dot. Man, he did it from the pocket. I mean, truly, like Drew Brees. To your point earlier, Drew Brees broke boundaries as a quarterback in many ways, and if you think about the modern era. So, okay, Drew Brees number 1. How do you think about Phillip Rivers and Alex Smith against each other?
Alex Smith had a lot of great years, and his career started out in a really rough way. I believe 5 different offensive coordinators in his first 5 years in the league. Always going to be compared to Aaron Rodgers because of the nature of that draft class, which is always going to be really tough. Picked number 1 overall out of Utah, where Rodgers infamously fell down into the 20s out of Cal. I think Alex Smith is going to have it tough because of the nature of being bounced out of San Francisco by Colin Kaepernick, and he played in a couple NFC Championship games, if I remember correctly, losing that game to the Giants in 2010, 2011.
You got that right?
And never really having those big flashy moments. He was a stat guy. And I think what's really tough is you look at Phillip Rivers and, hey, did I just make 70% of a similar argument of never really showing up in the playoffs, never really getting across the big game? And yeah, he won more games than he lost in the regular season, but I think it's really tough to look at either of these guys and move them on when you have Eli Manning sitting there with 2 rings. And I know you said compare Alex Smith and Phillip Rivers together, but we have to also take into account Eli Manning because we're only pairing it around a 15.
Right. I think where I was going with that is it's really hard to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. And so I think, like, if we can set these guys aside, then everybody that we will discuss after this pretty much comes ahead of them, because we're essentially saying of these 3, Drew Brees is the only one. I think that's what I'm saying. That could be a first ballot Hall of Famer. So let's set the other 2 guys aside.
Tiers above. Yes.
All right. So let's go into the other guys that are tiers above. I'm going to throw out a few names that I think don't make this cut line, right? And we don't need to talk about them. Jake Delhomme, I love you. You had an interesting year in Carolina. I remember you for throwing 5 interceptions in a game. You don't make the Hall of Fame. Donovan McNabb, I love you. You were awesome at Syracuse. I really enjoyed watching you come out and bomb it in the NFL. I loved those Eagle teams. I got to admit, I don't know if it's birds or whatever. The Seahawks have always been my first team. The Eagles have always been that team that I love second when I think back to Brian Westbrooks. And, there are just so many guys that have come through Philadelphia that I was enamored with. Terrell Owens and Donovan McNabb was one of them. I really like Donovan, but I'm sorry, Donovan McNabb, like, you're not going to make this cut when we get to the other guys on this list. You're not making the cut line. Jeff Garcia. I almost can't believe Jeff Garcia is on this list. It's kind of crazy, and I know that this is before your time, because Jeff Garcia was sort of the third in a line of what went from greatness to not greatness. I have to say it. Like, we went from Joe Montana leading the 49ers at quarterback, and then the baton gets passed to Steve Young, and Steve Young is an NFL MVP quarterback, and then the baton gets passed to Jeff Garcia. And Jeff Garcia was wily. He was like a poor man's Steve Young. Maybe an unhoused person's Steve Young.
It's almost like you cloned the first one and you got Steve Young, and then you cloned the clone, and that's when everything went off the rails.
I already made a multiplicity joke this week. Otherwise, I would make that here. But Jeff Garcia, love you. Remember some big moments. I don't remember who it was against, but I remember a big playoff game in San Francisco with Terrell Owens where they just showed out. Maybe it was against the Cowboys, but I remember Terrell Owens putting on a show on the field, and then a Terrell Owens show as well. So you're obviously worthy of being on this like big long list, Jeff Garcia, but you're not going to make it further. So then it comes down to four guys for me that I think are worth discussing: Steve McNair, Eli Manning, Rich Gannon, and Randall Too Hot to Handle Cunningham. And I think, this is where our age, we're 6 years apart. So like I just have more football and I remember football at different times of my life differently, but also you came into football differently kind of later in your life. So some of these things, I know Randall Cunningham is a one-way conversation. But I want to start where you want to start. So who do you want to start with?
Yeah, so for listeners, I started following football in 2009 when Oregon was down 21-3 to Stanford in Andrew Luck's junior year, and then they scored onside kick, scored to end the first half, and I fell in love. Aaron McNair is where I want to start. I spent a lot of time at Nike. There's posters of him everywhere, and I believe he also has a really tragic story on
He does.
how things kind of ended for him, for lack of a better term. And I want to hear about, because he the Music City Miracle as well? Or
Yeah.
was that, yeah, so I'd love to hear about him and what would
Well, and then
vaunt him
coming
up.
up just short in almost defeating the Rams' greatest show on turf offense in the Super Bowl. I mean, truly, the receiver on the end of his final pass was on the half-yard line. It was that close to being a Super Bowl champion. Aaron McNair was incredible. He came up in, I think it was Division II at the time, what's now FCS. He played at Alcorn State, and he was putting up these massive numbers. But, especially back then when guys didn't really transfer, you really didn't know what to make of a player coming out of Alcorn State. So, generally speaking, I don't think there was necessarily a broad awareness of just how special Steve McNair was coming into the league. He was obviously drafted very high. I remember back at the time that a lot of people, at least my age, were like, who? I was very into college football, so I knew who he was. I just wasn't sure that he was going to be great at the NFL level, but man, he had a big arm. But the biggest thing about Steve McNair was he was a big dude. And he would rumble for first downs. He would wheel out of the pocket. He made things happen. He was one of those dual threat quarterbacks that always looked to pass first. Like he was a pocket passer. He threw an incredible ball. He could throw it the length of the field, it felt like,
Ahead of
do
his
all the
time then.
things. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And you paired him with Eddie George at running back, who's on the list for running backs. We'll talk about Eddie George. But they were a pretty incredible combo, and they had Frank Wycheck at tight end. I mean, that was a ground and pound Tennessee offense that, ultimately, like, it ground down a lot of teams and it had a lot of success. It was a tragic ending. I won't go into it too much. Obviously, there was some domestic stuff going on, and Steve McNair was murdered. And it was after his playing days, so, it wasn't like a Sean Taylor situation with the at the time the Washington Redskins, now the Washington Commanders. That was a tragic story. Former Miami Hurricane Sean Taylor. We'll save that one for another day. He was one of the most special safeties I'd ever seen in my lifetime. But yeah, I think ultimately Steve McNair, if he is going to make it in, it's probably going to be partly because of the posthumous push. Like, he had a really great statistical career, but he didn't win that Super Bowl. And when you compare him to Eli Manning, who has 2 rings and also, played for a long time, was a great leader.
Face of the franchise, yeah.
Face of the franchise, but I'm going to say, what I think is even more impressive than being the face of a franchise, and even more impressive than being the face of the franchise of the New York Giants, where the press is as brutal as anywhere not
Unrelenting.
named Philadelphia. It's the fact that he did it in the shadow of his brother. Like, I think, and I realize as I say that you're my younger brother, and like we've
hey,
had
I
experiences
love
in
you.
life
You're
where-
not Peyton Manning.
I'm not Peyton Manning. No, I am not Peyton Manning. Far funnier than Peyton Manning. Peyton motivating Manning. I
Peyton
love
Manning.
Peyton Manning. I got to say I love Peyton Manning. But yeah, I think that's even more impressive. The fact that he had to do that in a league where, and it wasn't just Peyton. It was Archie Manning. It was just the Manning name, and look what he did. And so when I compare those two against each other, the helmet catch, and some might say, yeah, Eli's participation in the helmet catch, I mean, that was luck, right? Like, what a lucky catch. How often does that happen? My thing is, If you ask somebody my age or even your age, what are the 10 plays that you remember from the Super Bowl or for like the 10 most iconic plays in the NFL over the last 20 years? That's one of them. And the fact that defeated Brady and, ruined a perfect
I
season
was going
and
to say undefeated Brady.
Eli has these moments that I'm like, if the Hall of Fame is supposed to commemorate the players that have had the greatest impact on the sport, how is Eli Manning not in the Hall of Fame?
And it wasn't just Brady. I mean, he also snapped that 15-1 red hot Green Bay Packers team in the postseason as well. I believe en route to that 2010 Super Bowl as well, again over the Patriots.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I think we could both agree that Eli Manning head-to-head wins out against Steve McNair. And again, like I know that that's kind of a one-way conversation on McNair. I think a similar situation exists with Rich Gannon. Rich Gannon was before your time, Raiders quarterback, led the Raiders to a Super Bowl where, if I recall correctly, the Raiders center, Barrett Robbins, went missing the day before the Super Bowl, ended up being found. It was like a really tragic mental health situation. But like, as you can imagine, for a West Coast tempo, short passing offense like the Raiders were, missing your center, kind of a big deal. And ultimately, Rich Gannon didn't win that Super Bowl, lost to the Buccaneers. Got blown out, got absolutely housed by the Buccaneers and Tony Dungy. And I think, for me, Rich Gannon is an important piece of NFL history. He's one of those guys that, like, I remember among that second or third class of quarterbacks that came up in the late 80s and 90s. And but for me, he's not a Hall of Famer, and I don't think we need to talk about him a whole lot. Honestly, I'm not sure he should be on this list. I would say that he and Jeff Garcia are two names that I would just say, I can't see a world when I look forward at the guys who will come into eligibility in the future. I cannot see a world where either of those guys ever make the Hall of Fame.
Agreed. One note, that Super Bowl was also John Gruden's leftovers versus John Gruden's new team, right?
Oh, that's right. That was Gruden with the Bucs, not Tony Dungy with the Bucs. Because
who was with the Raiders?
Yeah. Did it go no, it went the other way, right? Didn't Gruden leave the Raiders and go to the Bucs?
I believe so.
Yeah, I thought he went from the Raiders to the Bucs, and then he won the Super Bowl with the Bucs over the Raiders. And if I recall correctly, Tony Dungy was the Bucs coach who vacated that position that John Gruden filled, and then Tony Dungy went to the Colts, where Tony Dungy won his ring with Peyton Manning. Hopefully we get that right. Somebody will fact check us. If we got that wrong, I'm sorry. Okay, one name left on the list. Again, I think this one's before your time. Randall, too hot to handle Cunningham. There's kind of two Randall Cunninghams for me. There's Randall Cunningham from my youth, the dual threat quarterback. There weren't a lot of black quarterbacks growing up. I think Randall Cunningham was just awesome on the field. And as somebody who loved that Eagle green and the Eagles offense, and I just really enjoyed Randall Cunningham. And I think, it's hard for me not to have my Randall Cunningham memory be that 15-1 Vikings season that, ultimately the Vikings lose the Super Bowl to the Atlanta Falcons.
They didn't lose the Super Bowl. They lost in the playoffs.
They lost the NFC Championship game.
Yes, and
to the Falcons, and then the Falcons lost the Super Bowl to the Broncos. Now we got that right.
And we are going to talk about one of the reasons they lost that game as well when we get to the place kicking section.
Yeah, fair. Gary Anderson, you're coming up, bro.
Never missed a kick all year.
Yeah, hey, we'll get to that. But look, Randall Cunningham had an incredible cast around him that year. It was, Robert Smith on the ground. We had Chris Carter and Randy Moss out wide. The defense was ferocious. That was an incredible team. Still can't believe it went down the way that it went down. We'll finish that conversation later. But Randall Cunningham, again, when I put Randall Cunningham up against Drew Brees and Eli Manning, I can't pick Randall Cunningham.
There's
So I
only
think we
11
have to
spots.
rule him out. Exactly. And so let's say for quarterback, we're going to set our top two aside and we can come back to it. Let's do that with each of these position groups. Let's get down to a top two and then let's circle back and fill out our 11 and then let's fill out who we think the inductees are going to be. Fair?
Fair?
All right, let's move on to running backs. There are a ton of running backs on this list. Why don't you give me the 4 running backs that you would rule out first?
That I would rule out.
Yeah, rule out. Like, hey, you shouldn't be on this list. When I look at this whole list, like some of these things are not like the other, and unfortunately, you're not making the Hall of Fame this year.
Okay, so you remember how we talked about I didn't start following football until 2010? This is going to really age me because I'm going to give you 1 name I know and 3 names I don't. The first
Okay.
is Arian Foster. He was
so
great.
wait, so do I get the opportunity to veto the 3 you don't?
Yes, you do.
Okay.
The first is Arian Foster, just because when I look at this list of the names of people that had like impactful careers, Arian Foster doesn't compare to them because he was on a Houston team that was ground and pound, and I distinctly remember a couple seasons where he was out and his backup stepped right in and filled that spot. And I don't want to say he was a system running back, but maybe he was a system running back a little bit. And then when he went to Miami, there wasn't a lot of juice left. So Arian Foster's one that surprises me.
Can I say Arian Foster was incredibly impressive because of his size for me. I remember Arian Foster, he was a little bit of an enigma. Like he definitely did things differently and had some interesting interviews and quotes. But it was the fact that he did what he did at his size, which didn't always work out. There are a lot of big backs that came into the NFL over the years that were expected to be able to play like smaller guys and be more agile. And he did it until, to your point, he ran out of steam, and that happens with running backs. So, okay, I'm good with Arian Foster being off this list.
Okay.
Who are the 3 you aren't familiar with?
Mike Alstott?
Okay, Mike Allstott, fullback. Mike Allstott, I gotta admit, he's one of my top 5 on this list. So
Okay.
we're gonna save Mike
Education
Allstott.
segment. Great.
Yeah. And I've got a Madden story about Mike Allstott in a second. There was a year where he was just unstoppable.
Thomas Jones?
I'm okay bringing Thomas Jones off this list. Honestly, Thomas Jones is one of those guys like Eddie George, who when you look at his career, he generated a lot of 1,000-yard seasons, but he was always like 4 yards a carry, and he would have some really decent games and some runs of games. But Thomas Jones and the Chicago Bears, like they won games. He played, if I recall correctly, Thomas Jones played with the Rex Grossman, Kyle Orton teams that did win a lot of games, but they were defense first. Those Lovie Smith teams were defense first. They were Devin Hester with the special teams. You know, that to me, like I don't know, like I'm not gonna put a lot of stock in that, and I'm gonna say I'm okay ruling him out off of this list. Sorry, Thomas Jones, you are not going to make the Hall of Fame in 2026.
Eric Metcalf is the 3rd unknown for me that I'm going to throw out there.
Yeah, Eric Metcalf was the 1980s into the early 90s running back. I remember him most with the Browns. He was kind of a do-everything running back. He was a returner as well. He's maybe scariest as a returner. Like, if Josh Cribbs doesn't make it, his Brown homie Metcalf isn't going to make it either. Eric Metcalf was a very good running back. Don't get me wrong. But he's not one of the 3 or 4 or 5 best running backs on this list for my money. All right, we just took a quick break, and now we are getting back to the running back discussion for the 2026 Professional Football Hall of Fame class. We're trying to get down to our 11 finalists and then get down to ultimately who we think the 4 inductees are going to be. We've talked about a handful of guys on this list already. We ruled out, let's see, Arian Foster. We ruled out Eric Metcalf. We're saving Mike Allstott. But I'm going to throw a couple of names that I think we can rule out. I'm sorry, Chris Johnson. I know you had one of the best single seasons of all time, CJ2K.
That was a
Tennessee
fun year.
Titans. Dude, if you had him in fantasy, that was an insane year. And he was great catching the ball out of the backfield. I want to say Chris Johnson went to East Carolina. He went to one of the Carolinas. I'm almost certain it was East Carolina. And I remember that was back when I used to have this like crazy old sports website called the Northwest Sports Den. And I remember writing about Chris Johnson coming into the league saying, oh, people just think he's this fast back, don't realize how good he's going to be. And man, for a few years, he was as good a running back as there was in the NFL. But I don't think the longevity was there. Didn't really win anything.
They were a one and done that year. They were the top seed, lost in their first game.
Yeah, so I think that we can rule our friend Chris Johnson off of this list. I also think that we can rule LaShawn McCoy off of this list. LaShawn McCoy was kind of a prototypical running back for an Andy Reid offense, and he was really great for a long time, and then went through some transition later in his career. And, ultimately, LaShawn McCoy, I don't even need to look at the numbers just to know that like he was a good running back. But if you ask me who were the 5 or 10 best running backs of that generation, where I'm not sure that I would pick LaShawn McCoy, so how does that make you a Hall of Famer? So LaShawn McCoy, you're also out. I would like to eliminate 2 fullbacks because we've got 3 fullbacks on the list. We certainly can't have 3. Lorenzo Neal, fullback for the Chargers in the 90s. And then, if I recall correctly, he was also the fullback going into the LaDainian Tomlinson years. Love a good fullback. Lorenzo Neal, can barely remember what teams you were on. You're not a Hall of Famer to me. Larry Centers, Arizona Cardinals fullback. He was also a beast, but again, you've got to be really special to make it as a fullback to me. And there's only one guy on this list who was a really, really special fullback, and that was Mike Allstott. They used to say you're in good hands with Allstott, and the Tampa Bay running game revolved around Mike Allstott blocking for Warrick Dunn. And Mike Allstott on 3rd and 1s, 4th and 1s, like what the tush push is today, it was almost impossible to stop Mike Allstott. Like when they would line him up in, a straight up I with Warrick Dunn behind him. And at that time, you couldn't push a guy forward quite like you can now. But Allstott, man, he would just run into the line. He would get that 1 yard. He could also catch the ball out of the backfield. He was extremely fast. And that's what made him so deadly in Madden, is that he really was like a fast, big, strong fullback. He was kind of Peyton Hillis plus before Peyton Hillis. And when you would run him for that 1 yard, oftentimes he would just break through the line and he would rip off like a 40-yard gain or a 50-yard touchdown. So Mike Allstott, absolute Madden all-time fullback hero, the greatest Madden fullback of all time. For my money, the only fullback on this list who we can put on kind of that final 5 or so. Otherwise, the other fullbacks, they've got to go. Sorry, gents. All right, now I've also got to cross off Warrick Dunn. As much as I love Mike Allstott, we can't have 2 Buccaneers in the final 2. And Warrick Dunn also had some good years in Atlanta. He was a very good running back, great running back going all the way back to Florida State. But Warrick Dunn for me is not one of the top names on this list. I'm going to throw out some names that I would take above Warrick Dunn on this list. And maybe if you've got other ones, we can start honing this down. I would take Frank Gore, Marshawn Lynch, Fred Taylor, and I'm going to go with Priest Holmes.
You go Priest
Those would be
Holmes
the
over
guys.
Tiki Barber, huh?
Yeah, well, it is a tough that if you wanted to swap in Tiki Barber, those were the 2 that I was looking at. So let's call it Tiki Barber. I think Tiki is a noble name to add to this list. He did really incredible things with the Giants, and certainly was one of the key reasons that they were able to bring championships to New York. Where do you want to start in those names? Should we start with our friend Marshawn Lynch?
Yeah, I think we should. Incredible, incredible moments. Everybody remembers the beast mode run in that playoff game. But there was also that second beast mode run a couple years later against Arizona.
I mean, the first one, you're right. Like the Beastquake, the first time around, we were a 7-9 team that won the division.
The division, yes. But then we beat the defending champions.
Yeah. Absolutely. Beat the New Orleans Saints in Seattle with the Beastquake. But it wasn't like we were expected to even come close to winning that game going into kickoff.
Absolutely. And then he had a very similar run a couple years later against Arizona. I think it was just a regular season game, but it was another one of those where he shed 7, 8 tackles and he jumped emphatically in the end zone, and it is something that I will always remember. So he's had multiple moments, and he was... that
The
driving
Seahawks'
force.
entire offense revolved around Marshawn Lynch in the running game. It was all about that, and that enabled Russ Wilson to develop the way that he did. And, I mean, there were a lot of great receivers that came through in those years, the Bobby Ingrams of the world. Bobby's the first name that comes to mind, but Darrell Jackson. And, I mean, there are a lot of great guys that came through. Um, I think for me, um, it really came down to that running game of Marshawn Lynch. And if you take Marshawn Lynch out of that, the Seahawks not only are not a Super Bowl contender, but if that trade from Buffalo never goes down, if Marshawn Lynch never has that hit and run, we're not going to get into that, why Marshawn Lynch had to leave Buffalo, despite being one of the top running backs in the league. But if that never happens, the Seahawks, I don't think, are even a perennial playoff team, much less Super Bowl championship. And really, if you'd just given the ball to Marshawn, you'd have 2 Super Bowls.
Yeah, that one still stings. And we had a great defense. The Seahawks had a great defense time also, obviously a very
No doubt.
big Seahawks. And that would have been good enough to win divisions. It would have been good enough to be in the win divisions. I actually take that back because of how good the Niners were under Harbaugh those years. So I don't know if that would have been good enough to win the division without Lynch. But
That's what they mean when they talk
yeah,
about complementary football. Like, does your offense and defense complement each other? If that defense was paired with an offense that was super high risk, that had very short time of possession, was trying for chunk plays all the time, that defense was going to be on the field too much and was going to break down. They had to be paired with an offense that could grind the clock, that could get 3, 4, 5 yards per carry, and also have the ability to break it, have good play action, that sort of thing. I mean, it was a perfect pairing of offense and defense. And for me, Marshawn Lynch is a Hall of Famer. Like, at least he is, when you look at him on paper and you look at his bona fides and the Pro Bowls and you look at the team accolades, Marshawn Lynch is the kind of guy that belongs in the Hall of Fame. When you just look at what he meant to the NFL, Marshawn, I mean, he still does commercials because Marshawn was such a personality and he had such an imprint on the NFL and NFL fandom in those years.
he also played
Marshawn's
for
got a,
he played for 12 years, and he
which
was a
is
big
so impressive for a
bruising running back. Like, that longevity
Yeah.
is, and that 12th year is a little bit of an asterisk because the Seahawks signed him for, I think, 2 games at the very end
Yeah.
of the season, but he scored touchdowns in both those games, I believe. So, like, it's not like it was nothing, but he was a statement, and he was one of the big identities next to the Legion of Boom of those Seahawks teams.
And so now I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, for me, it's Marshawn over Tiki. Because while I appreciate everything Tiki did for the Giants, when I think about guys like Plaxico Burress, and when I think about guys like Jeremy Shockey, and I think about guys like Eli Manning, I think there are other pieces of that offense that if you substituted for a similar player who maybe wasn't quite as good, it would be not as catastrophic of a change in the results versus the Seahawks. If you substitute Marshawn Lynch, I mean, I think for anybody else in the league, like, tell me who else in the league that had that mindset, that had that running style, that had the relationship with Pete Carroll.
I mean, Skittles, man. He has a
Skittles,
candy that
yeah.
is his. One thing I'm
So
curious.
for me, it's
yeah.
Marshawn over Tiki. For me, it's just like all day long. If we're gonna whittle this down and we're gonna get to 2 guys, it's Marshawn over Tiki, and then I gotta say it's Marshawn over Allstott. Like, I love Mike Allstott, but I wouldn't put Mike Allstott into the Hall of Fame over Marshawn Lynch. Marshawn Lynch has had a much bigger impact on the history of the NFL, and he has the raw performance to back it up.
Agreed.
Okay, so then there's 2 names left on this list to make a top 2 out of. One of these guys makes the top 2, and then we move on to wide receivers.
Are we
Frank
including
Gore,
Fred Taylor in this since he's already into that 4 because he was a previous finalist that made that up? So are we talking
Fred
about
Taylor was not on that list. No,
Okay.
the previous
Got
4 that are locked up are Willie Anderson,
Not even
Corey
talking about
Holt, Luke Kuechly, and Adam Vinatieri.
Okay.
Right? And so Fred Taylor is on the list. And we've got to choose between Taylor and Gore.
I mean, I know where my gut's going, and this is going to inform the wide receiver selection, but we just talked about longevity. We just talked about the identity of a franchise. We just talked about gaudy stats with Breeze. Frank Gore, he played all throughout the 2000, the aughts. He played through most of the 2010s. Like, he was the San Francisco 49ers at a high level for almost decades, multiple. I mean, he played
It was
on
crazy.
what, the 2002 Miami team that won the national
Yeah,
championship, and like,
there was nobody more dependable than Frank Gore.
and he didn't get hurt. Am I remembering that right? Until he went to
I mean,
Indianapolis?
I can't think of a year that Frank Gore suffered a serious injury myself.
Frank Gore's my guy next to Marshawn.
So I mean, I think it is hard not to put those two guys next to each other in the final two. Before I move on to Fred Taylor and just make a small case for Fred Taylor, I do want to call out. I just checked it on the side. Frank Gore didn't really have any injuries that slowed down his NFL career. You're right. But Frank Gore suffered multiple ACL tears, first in his left knee in college in 2002, and then in his right knee. And he missed the entire second half of the 2003 season, and then came back to the NFL after all of that to dominate for years and years and years on end. So, when we talk about guys that come in with a risky injury history, I mean, nobody had a riskier injury history than Frank Gore. And still, to talk about turning around, kind of like Steph Curry and Steph Curry's early ankle injuries. And then you look years and years and years of sustained health. Okay, so small case for Fred Taylor. Fred Taylor was the Jacksonville Jaguars running back out of Florida, played with Mark Brunell. The very first year the Jacksonville Jaguars were a franchise, they made the AFC Championship game. And that was really exciting. And Fred Taylor, I want to say Keenan McCardle was the wide receiver on that team. They had Tony Baselli at left tackle. If I recall correctly, Tony Baselli was the #1 overall pick in the expansion draft by the Jaguars. Man, I love that team. I love the teal and the black, and it was really exciting. I think also the Carolina Panthers, as the other expansion team, also made the NFC Championship game that year. It's kind of crazy to think back on that two expansion teams, when we typically expect an expansion team to come in and do very poorly, we have those two examples. And then, of course, the Vegas Golden Knights as examples of how that is not necessarily a given. You can have a great year, great first year as an expansion team. But Fred Taylor, look, I love you, Fred. I very sentimentally want to choose you, especially like as a Husky fan growing up and a big Mark Brunell fan. Can't choose you. We're going to move on. I also realized that I didn't mention Ricky Watters. Ricky Watters, player of the 80s and then into the 90s. He was a Seahawk, although those were not Ricky Watters' kind of peak years. His peak years were with the 49ers when they were contending for NFC championships and Super Bowls. But Ricky Watters, Jamal Lewis. Is there anybody else? Corey Dillon. I love you, Corey Dillon. UW Husky, Corey Dillon, New England Patriot, Corey Dillon, Cincinnati Bengal, Corey Dillon. None of you guys, to me, eclipse the profile and the imprint on the league that Frank Gore and Marshawn Lynch had. Do any of those names strike you as needing reconsideration?
Absolutely not. The only thing I'll say, Steven Jackson and Jamal Charles, both also on this list, won me my very first fantasy football league, so they will always be near and dear to my heart, but they are not of the same profile. And Sean Alexander, love you, but if we swapped out anybody behind that offensive line that took the Seahawks to their very first Super Bowl, we would have been just fine.
Yeah, and I've got to say, Sean Alexander, my memories of Sean Alexander are of him curling up in a little ball when he would get swamped. And I mean, he was great when he would break big runs, but he was not always the most fun running back to watch. I do love Jamal Charles. I loved watching him play with the Kansas City Chiefs. He was a perennial Pro Bowl selection there, and he could break a big one. He had fumble problems. I remember that too, coming out of Texas, which is why he was drafted where he was drafted. But he was definitely an incredible talent. And then there was one name that's left on the list. I wanted to hold him until last, Eddie George. So we talked about Steve McNair earlier. Eddie George was, if he didn't win the Heisman, he was a Heisman finalist at Ohio State, and then he came to what were the Houston Oilers, and then Houston moved to Tennessee. He was a linchpin of that team and that transition, and then really getting the team rooted in Tennessee. Eddie George was not the flashiest back. He was 3-4 yards per carry. He was incredibly reliable. Um, I I might be romanticizing Eddie George a little bit. I just remember him when we're talking about Frank Gore, when we're talking about Marshawn Lynch. Eddie George to me was the Marshawn Lynch and the Frank Gore of that era. The Tennessee Titans, and prior to that, the Houston Oilers, when he was they were Eddie George, and Eddie George enabled Aaron McNair to be Aaron McNair because he was so reliable. And so I would put Eddie George on this list. Ultimately, I think recency bias has got to win, and the fact that at least in Lynch's case, you definitely got a Super Bowl ring. Gore won a Super Bowl, didn't he?
Nope.
Didn't win a Super Bowl ring?
San Francisco never won a Super Bowl with Gore, and then he went to the
You're
Colts.
right, yeah.
Yeah. He played in a couple.
You're right. You're right. He did play in a couple, never won one. And so I think when you're looking at the pecking order between these three guys who are in many ways similarly situated.
He only played in one. Sorry. They lost to the Ravens, yeah.
I think it's Marshawn 1 and Frank Gore 2. And ultimately, I mean, we can come back and hash this one out later, but my vote is going to go to Marshawn, and it's going to sound like a homer vote, but I think that we've defended it pretty well.
I'm trying to take the homer out of it, and that's why I lean towards Frank Gore, but it's hard not to look at Marshawn. And again, narrative, stats, flashy moments, and a ring. My argument for Drew Brees, they're all there for Marshawn.
Yeah, yeah. And look, just to remind everybody, there are 21 running backs who are nominated among the 128 players. So, realistically, you could make a great argument for a lot of these guys. As we said, by the time you get down to 11 or you get down to 4, it's pretty unassailable because you're talking about the best of the best of the best of NFL history. But let's talk about wide receivers. There are 18 wide receivers. And there are a wide range of wide receivers in here, a bunch of names that I remember fondly. I'm going to give you 5 names of the 18 names that I want to rule out. And then you tell me if any of those, you can have one veto. And then we'll do it the other way. And then you give me 5 names that you want to rule out, and I'll keep one veto if I think I need it. Sound fair?
Fair.
Okay, we'll keep going down until we get down to the last. All right, so the 5 names that I'm going to rule out. Derek Mason. Very good career for the Baltimore Ravens. He had a number of years where he put up number 1 wide receiver stats. Very impressive. But Derek Mason, you are not going to be a 2026 Hall of Famer. Donald Driver of the Green Bay Packers. Again, like Derek Mason, he had some big years. I remember the Driver Rodgers years that were really great there for a few years where he drove that offense, and Donald Driver would run routes across the middle. Donald Driver would run routes down the field. He kind of did it all. But I'm sorry, Donald Driver, you're not going to be a 2026 Hall of Famer. Muhsin Muhammad from the Carolina Panthers. Muhsin Muhammad was a very good receiver. He does not belong among the top receivers on this list, and so I've got to cross him off. Jordy Nelson, another Packer. Jordy Nelson, I love the wide receiver thing. Like, there aren't that many huge, super fast, uber athletic wide receivers. Jordy Nelson was one, but unfortunately, Jordy Nelson, you're not going to make my list. And then Brandon Lloyd, what are you doing on this list, Brandon Lloyd? I do remember he had a couple of good years with the 49ers and with the Broncos, but he has no business being on this list. So cross. Do you veto any of those 5s?
I had all those marked in red, so we're good there.
All right, great. Who are your 5?
So the first one I'm going to start off with is somebody near and dear to me because that same year I won a fantasy football league. I had him and his quarterback threw a pick. This was the 13-3 Saints season. He was playing for the Atlanta Falcons. I was down by 0.4 points, and I needed him to get a catch. Instead, he got a quote-unquote tackle by touching down the cornerback that got that interception. And I won that week, and we went on to win that league as an 8 seed. That is Roddy White. Great wide receiver, but he was the number 2 there for a really long time. He had a kind of rotating cast of number 1 receivers come in, and he was there for a long time. But I'm confused why he's on this list. I'm not angry. I'm confused. So that's number 1 for me. Number 2 is Brandon Marshall, who I feel bad about this because he's a great talent, but I feel like he suffered from never really being in an offense that could unlock his full potential. He was a longtime Bronco, and then he went to the Bears, and he was supposed to be the greatest Bear wide receiver that ever happened, but as is typically the case when people go to the Bears from an offensive standpoint, they just kind of get bogged down by offensive scheme, lack of quarterback, and kind of a defense-driven offense. Those are the 2 that I know. We're going to talk about the fun game of John Doesn't Know Football, dating back past the early 2010s. Herman Moore, Jimmy Smith, and Rod Smith. Talk to me about those guys.
Yeah, so Herman Moore was a receiver for the Detroit Lions, and he played alongside Barry Sanders when the Lions went from not being respectable to respectability. And it seemed like there was going to be a moment before Barry Sanders retired that they could actually get into that top echelon of teams in the league. Ultimately, I have no problem crossing Herman Moore off of this list. He was definitely a multi-time Pro Bowl receiver during his era. But when I look at guys who also played in his era, maybe not completely overlapping, Jimmy Smith. So I said earlier that Fred Taylor and the Jacksonville Jaguars had Keenan McCardle on the outside. That's not right. Keenan McCardle, if I recall correctly, was a Tampa Bay Buccaneer, and Jimmy Smith was the Jacksonville Jaguars do-everything superstar wide receiver, and he was impressive. He was so impressive. I think of the 3 guys on this list, though, the guy that would make it would be Rod Smith. Like, if you're going to whittle down to a top 5, it's going to be Rod Smith playing with the Denver Broncos. He was John Elway's number 1 wide receiver. Of course, John Elway's number 2 wide receiver, Ed McCaffrey, father to Christian McCaffrey, and John Elway's tight end, Shannon Sharp. Maybe the best ever to do it. Maybe not the best ever. I mean, Antonio Gates last year was incredible. He might be the best tight end ever. It's not Travis Kelce, I'll tell you that. Sorry. It's definitely not Travis Kelce. But I think when you look at Rod Smith, he was a big play receiver that converted all kinds of key plays and had a hand in so many important moments for the Denver Broncos in winning Super Bowls with John Elway, and finally having that moment when for years and years and years, the narrative was Elway can't win the big one. And that, of course, was compounded by the fact that Elway dictated where he was going to play. So, interesting storyline there. I think that we should set Rod Smith aside. If we're thinking about making like a top 5 for the wide receivers, Rod, I think, has got to be on the list. But let's go ahead, snake draft. Give me your next 5.
So my next 5 that I would eliminate, or my
next 5 that you would eliminate.
Oh, geez. Well, there's not many left. The first is going to be Wes Welker, which is, a tough one. He was a longtime Patriot, a longtime Bronco, but he had concussion issues. He had the infamous I think he was on Molly at the Kentucky Derby, and that was a fun offseason. But, he was never the number 1. He was a great slot receiver, but is a great slot receiver who was the supporting cast really the guy that's going to go in the Hall of Fame? I don't think so. The next one after that, Hines Ward. Hines, you were great in Pittsburgh, and I loved you in The Dark Knight as the guy returning the punt. But not on this list just because of the quality of the other guys. So that's 2. Now it really gets difficult. I've got to pick the next 3. I know who they are, but I don't want to say their names because that only leaves 2. I don't want to pick Anquan.
Well, I'm interested to see you get down to that because I've got my list of top 4, and Rod Smith is on there, and then I've got 3 other names on my list for the top 4, and I'm curious if you're going to eliminate one of them.
Well, I mean, the top 4. I'm looking at this list. Torrey Holt already is on the list because he's
locked.
He's locked. So,
but he doesn't count in the 11, right?
Yeah,
so Torrey Holt, he's locked.
So Larry Fitzgerald, it's his first year. He's in for me. Like, if we talked about Frank Gore, Larry Fitzgerald is Frank Gore as a wide receiver, plus more years, plus, he's Larry Fitzgerald, and he could have gone to better teams despite the shittiness that was the Arizona quarterback situation before Kurt Warner, and kind of between Kurt Warner and Matt Leinart, if I'm remembering that right. Mm-hmm. And then, he was a ball boy for the Minnesota Vikings, and he just chose to stick it out with the Cardinals when he could have gone to Minnesota in free agency. Anquan Boldin is another person that I want on my list because of his longevity and his ability to
But
go.
can you have both Fitzgerald and Bolden? Like, can you have the number one and the number two from Arizona?
That's the thing that I'm struggling with because I remember
You got to pick.
Anquan Boldin going to different teams and then having explosive first, second, third games before kind of settling back to the mean. So that's a fair point.
Anquan Bolden might be the toughest wide receiver that has ever played in the NFL. I will say that about Anquan Bolden. It's tough because Anquan Bolden was on my list and he was in my top four, and I had the same dilemma. I made a top four, and I had two guys from essentially like their peak career years come from playing together on opposite sides of the field. And Anquan Bolden was insane. I mean, the hits that he would take back at a time when you could take huge hits, incredible. But I don't think that you can put him ahead of Fitzgerald because I think Fitzgerald was a generational wide receiver.
100%. So Larry Fitzgerald's my number one. Reggie Wayne is my number two out of Indianapolis. I know he's been a previous finalist already. I don't know if that clouds things since it's like, well, we gave him a shot, we didn't give him a shot. But like he was Peyton's number one for a number of years, and correct me if I'm wrong here.
Yes, but like actually in the first several years, his number one was Marvin Harrison. And Reggie Wayne was his number two receiver. And Reggie Wayne benefited. He had a lot of great years. And Dallas Clark at tight end, that was a super talented team, right? And I think, and by the way, Edgerrin James, anyone coming out of the backfield? Edgerrin James was insane. He was an insane player. So for me, I'm looking at Reggie Wayne, and I'm wondering, how do you compare Reggie Wayne to Chad Ochocinco, who was the number one receiver in Cincinnati and put up huge stats for years? And if Carson Palmer didn't get his knee blown out in those playoffs, does Chad Ochocinco have a ring?
Chad Ochocinco, Chad Johnson on my list, officially Ochocinco, is my number three here. Because how can you look past his dominance? Multiple 1,000-yard seasons, multiple flashy moments. He, loud, explosive, kind of in your face. I remember his interview where he was doing sit-ups while he was giving the interview. Like,
that's my quarterback, man.
He was a personality. You gotta love him. And then Steve Smith is my fourth one. Played for a long, long time, was a Carolina staple, went through a number of different quarterbacks, and then his revenge game against Carolina when he went to Baltimore is forever etched in my brain because he just had a chip on his shoulder at all times, and he was always motivated. He never took the day off.
Yeah, that's fair. I had ruled Steve Smith out. He was not in my top four because I remember him being a big play wide receiver, played with Jake Delhomme, and they would throw those balls all the time. But that's also how Jake Delhomme threw 5 interceptions in a game, was because their offense was Steve Smith, go long. And then when he lost it, he really kind of lost it. And so he was a great fantasy player for years, and definitely Carolina relied on him on the outside. And I know that at the time, and he probably still hates the argument that he wasn't big enough to be a true number one wide receiver. But when I look at this list, I can't put him ahead of Reggie Wayne, and I can't put him ahead of Larry Fitzgerald. Fair. So I think for me, those are the two guys that I settle on, in addition to Torrey Holt, because obviously Torrey's a lock.
So we're saying our top two are Larry Fitzgerald and Reggie Wayne?
I'm saying that, yeah. I'm good with that. If you're good with that.
Those are the two that I have highlighted in green.
All right, so our tight ends, we've only got 6 tight ends. I'm not actually convinced that we have to have a tight end on our list.
There's only one that I would consider.
Okay, so who's the one that you would consider?
Jason Witten.
Jason Witten. Okay.
The other tight ends, for folks listening, Vernon Davis, Zach Miller, Greg Olson, which I don't like him as an announcer.
He was the only other one that I would consider.
He's in yellow for me. Everybody else is in red. Wesley Walls and Delaney Walker.
Love Delaney Walker, but bro, you are not going into the 2026 Hall of Fame.
Agreed. And for me, Jason Witten, he could block, he could catch. He was a reliable staple of both the Tony Romo and the early Dak Prescott Cowboys offenses. If you had a fantasy team, he was probably the number 4 or number 5 tight end off the board every year. Like
At
he
least,
could do it
if
all,
not higher. Yeah.
and he did it
No,
for a
you're
long
right.
time.
You're right. You're absolutely right. I'm okay having Jason Witten as a consideration. But when I think about the other names on this list and the impact that they had on the game, when I think about Jason Witten compared to Antonio Gates last year, it's hard for me to get excited about Jason Witten. I would say this whole list: Vernon Davis, love you, great player, not a Hall of Famer. Zach Miller, really? Why are you on this list? Greg Olson, Wesley Walls, same deal. Like early Panthers tight end, okay. Delaney Walker, loved you with the Titans. Like definitely had some 3 touchdown games that worked out great for me in fantasy, but none of y'all making the cut. Jason Witten, unfortunately, I don't think you're making the cut either. So, I mean, unless you really want to keep him on the
Oh no
consideration
no no
list
no!
for the final 11.
This was me saying this is the only one I would consider.
Okay, so then let's say no tight ends.
I'm fine with that.
All right, now
11's really hard. We got a lot of players to whittle this down to.
we do. We do. All right, and we haven't even gotten to the defensive side of the ball yet.
Dude, the offensive lineman set is the most players out of anybody. This is giving me a ton of anxiety even looking at this list.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe, maybe we should split this into 2 episodes and then do offensive players and defensive players. And then I can edit this part out that we're talking right now.
Yeah, and then we can basically pare it down to, obviously we said 2 offense, 2 defense get in. That'll make that easier. And we can throw kickers. I mean, we're not going to talk about kickers and special teams, right? Adam Vinatieri is the only one that's going to get in by nature of him being top 7 last year.
We'll just gloss through
Yeah.
it. And yeah, okay. All right. 3, 2, 1. All right, and we're back after taking a quick break. We are almost through the offensive players. This episode is going to cover all the offensive players. We're going to get down to our final 2 recommendations for induction in the 2026 class of the Hall of Fame. And then we're going to come back at you with another episode where we talk through the defense. So getting back to it, we've got the offensive lineman left. Just one last sprint to go through. But boy, it is a big sprint, John. There are 22 offensive linemen on the list. And this is more difficult. It's kind of the less your name is called as an offensive lineman, the better you're doing. You know, how do you think, John, about measuring and comparing and contrasting across offensive linemen? Not even
This is
just
really
without
hard
the
for me.
stats, but positions, because centers aren't guards, aren't tackles, and the eras are so different. How are you thinking about it?
I mean, this is really tough for me because I'm not a huge football nerd. When I listen to different podcasts and people are talking about coverage and guards and all of that kind of stuff, a lot of it goes over my head. So it's eye test for me, and then it's looking at basically longevity. If you're a bad offensive lineman, your career's going to be short or you're going to play a backup. So I'm trying to look at things like games played. I'm trying to look at things like sacks given up. I'm trying to wrap my head around the key KPIs that's like calling it an ATM machine, that would indicate success for an offensive lineman. And, you know, using previous finalists and comps as a metric. And so I have 3 of these folks highlighted in green, in addition to Willie Anderson, who, as we've talked about, is automatically in top 7 last year.
Yep.
And then a lot of these names, if I'm being honest, I don't know who they are. So that's going to be one of those things where it may be a bit of a one-sided conversation.
Let's just go through the names that you don't know, and I'm going to tell you if anybody jumps out to me as like absolutely needing to be considered in a final 3 or 4.
Okay, Matt Burke.
Super awesome offensive lineman for the Baltimore Ravens, played a ton of years, great player. I don't think he needs to be on the list.
Lomas Brown.
Lomas Brown was, if I recall correctly, a tackle for the Detroit Lions. Again, if I remember, he played with Barry Sanders. He was back in the Herman Moore, Andre Pete, Rodney Pete days. Rodney Pete days? No, who am I thinking of? Forgetting the Detroit quarterback at the time, but no, Lomas Brown. We can cross you off.
Reuben Brown.
Even I don't remember who Reuben Brown is.
Okay. Ryan Clady.
Ryan Clady was a beastly tackle, left tackle with the Broncos, but Ryan Clady, you are crossed off the list.
Jordan Gross.
Jordan Gross was a tackle. If I recall correctly, he was out of Utah, and he played for the Carolina Panthers. I remember him being a very strong tackle, but Jordan Gross, you don't stand out to me as being the top offensive lineman on this list.
Ryan Khalil.
Ryan Khalil actually is, for me, he's probably a top five guy. One of the great centers that have come through the NFL in the last 20 years. He was an absolute beast. He was very very consistent on the field. Um, but then when I think about Ryan Khalil versus Jeff Saturday, if I'm going to pick a center, I'm going to pick Jeff Saturday over every other center on this list. If I'm being honest.
Agreed. Saturday is highlighted in green for me. Olin Kreutz.
Olin Kreutz was actually a UW Husky. He was a really nasty offensive lineman. I believe he ended up playing for the Pittsburgh Steelers for most of his career, and he was very good, but I don't think that he's going to be. Look, like let's be really honest. There's not going to be multiple offensive linemen who make the final four. And that means that we're probably going to have two at most who make our final 15. And one of those is already eaten up by Willie Anderson. So I think what we're trying to do is figure out, and like right now, top guy on the board, Jeff Saturday. Does anybody else beat out Jeff Saturday for that second
Okay,
finalist
so
slot?
let's approach it from that perspective. Let me give you the three
Yeah.
people I have highlighted in green, and you can tell me if anybody else on your list is missing here. David
Okay.
DeCastro, Jari Evans, and Marquise Pouncey are the people that I would put up as a contender to Jeff Saturday. Not saying that they're better than him, but those are the ones that I think we should maybe ground the conversation around. Joe Staley is maybe another person in that list, but is there anybody missing that you think we should touch on before we actually talk about who we would nominate in addition to Willie Anderson?
Marshall Yonda. Marshall Yonda was the anchor of that Baltimore offensive line
Another previous
during
finalist
the
as well.
yeah, yeah. I mean, he was absolutely a beast. And so for me, it really comes down to Yonda and Saturday. I think the reason why I would say them over Marquise Pouncey. I think Pouncey was a very good center. I think that the Indianapolis teams with Jeff Saturday made a bigger imprint on the league. And maybe that's not fair that Saturday drafts off the fact that you've got a Peyton Manning and a Dallas Clark and a Marvin Harrison, and now you've got a finalist in Reggie Wayne. Like you got a lot of guys, and it's like, well, wait a second. If they're all transitive property, right? If they're all Hall of Famers, so the hell am I. And when you think back to the Steelers, like again, love Pouncey, but I don't know. It's hard for me to wrap my head around him. And again, we don't have the stats to really bear this out. This is as subjective as it's going to get
The only
in
thing we really
this
have
process.
is first team or second team all pros and then career longevity. And I feel like you're comparing a Granny Smith apple with a Cosmic Crisp apple. Like you're looking at two incredible things, and there's nothing that really makes one statistically stand out against the other. So I'm okay with Jeff Saturday.
Jari Evans was the other name that you mentioned that I understand. I mean, he was a beastly guard for the Saints for years and years and years and years. He was, if I recall, he was on the left side of the line for Drew Brees. And I think, there's a great case for him as well, but it's tough. For me, I'm probably going to go with Jeff Saturday would be my pick. But I think, if I'm filling out my 11, I think if you look at who we actually think they would select and who they would actually put into the finalist grouping, right? Who are the voters, the selection committee going to choose? I think that they're going to choose Marshall Yonda again. I think that you're going to get in that 15, you're going to get Yonda, you're going to get Willie Anderson, and you might get Jari Evans again. But I'm not sure that you will get Jari Evans again.
I think that's fair.
All right. So then let's go back and think about how many slots this takes up. So we've got 15 total. Let's see. At quarterback, we're saying Eli and Breeze. So that takes up 2 slots. At wide receiver, we know we've got Torrey Holt. We're saying Reggie Wayne and Larry Fitzgerald.
So we're up to 5.
Yep, that gives us 5. At running back, we're saying Lynch and Gore,
So up to 7.
up to 7. At offensive line, we're saying Willie and Yonda.
So that's 9. So we got
That's
6 more
9.
slots,
So,
and 2 of those are already taken.
yeah, and the 2 that are already taken are, and I'll draw a line, those are taken by Keekly and Vinatieri,
Yep.
which I get it, but boy, it does feel a little bit weird having one of the slots being taken up by a kicker,
If there
given
was
how
ever
precious
a
they are.
kicker to take that
I
up, though,
agree.
multiple game-winning Super Bowls, he kicked for a long time. He was the franchise kicker for 2 different teams, and with the Patriots, they thought they moved on to Gostkowski. They thought Vinatieri was old news, and then he kicked for what, 10 years with the Colts, and hit multiple game winners.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're going to have to eliminate one of these names on the offensive side of the ball from the list of 9 that we have, so that we can balance it out a little bit better. Because right now there are only 5 spots for defenders. I think it's better instead of 9 and 5 with a kicker if we are 8 and 6 with a kicker. I mean, we could go 7 and 7 with a kicker. That's probably the most reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And if we gotta boot one, Reggie Wayne, I'm sorry, but Larry just took your spot.
Yep. Larry took your spot, and you're not going to bump out Torrey Holt. Okay, so now we can be a little bit imbalanced, and we've got 5 spots open for the defense when we come back to the defense in our second episode. Now, let's see here. This is essentially who we think they're going to put in, correct? Is that what we're saying? We're saying that we think these guys are going to make the list. Um, and I've said that, for me, I would swap out Marshall Yonda with Jeff Saturday. That would be a change that I would make. Um, Otherwise, I actually really like the list that we've made. I don't think there's anybody else that I would editorially change. I think that this feels like a really good, fair list for the offense.
I agree.
Now, now, John, assuming that this is the list, there are 2 spots for offensive players in the class of 2026. Who makes it?
Drew Brees, no doubt. Like, that's as no-brainer as it gets. One's easy. Now, one spot for all the other people we listed, good Lord, that is a difficult question. I don't think it's going to be Frank Gore or Marshawn. I think that
I
Gore's
agree
going
with
to
you
have
on
to
that.
wait. I don't
Yep.
think it's going
And
to be Larry
Marshawn's going to have
Fitz.
to wait.
The only wide receivers that I can think of that were first ballot Hall of Famers were Jerry Rice and Calvin Johnson. And Calvin Johnson, as much as I love Larry Fitzgerald, like, shortened career by choice. He was explosive. He set the receiving record. He had that 2,000-yard season, even though he played for a shitty team that was playing from behind. But he was Calvin Johnson. Like, the eye test set him above as something extraordinarily special. It's really hard to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. So I don't think it's going to be Larry Fitzgerald. With me, that then leaves me with, is it going to be Torrey Holt, Willie Anderson, or is it going to be Marshall Yonda? I think I'm going to go with Willie Anderson. I think they're going to put a lineman in. This is who they are picking. I think Torrey Holt's going to have another shot at this next year. That's where I land. What do you think?
I had the exact same 2 identified. I would love to tell you, oh, you're wrong, and I'm going to go this other direction, but I think the exact same thing. Look, Willie Anderson did make that final 7. He was really close. So he has a lot of the votes. I don't think 1 year later, Willie Anderson is going to materially lose votes. It's not like anything happened there, right? Or anybody became eligible that would steal a bunch of votes away from Willie Anderson. Well, maybe Drew Brees, right? But I think that to your point, Drew Brees, he's going to lose some votes to Eli. I think we got that quarterback analysis right, and I think he's going to lose some votes there. But ultimately, I think he is going to be the guy that goes in. The quarterbacks are the NFL, right? Like it all revolves around the hardest position in sports. It's playing quarterback, and Drew Brees did it as well or better than anybody who's ever done it. And I think that that has to count for something. It was Drew, it was Peyton, it was Tom Brady for years and years and years. They were the guys. So I agree with you. It's going to be Drew Brees. I do think it's going to be Willie Anderson. I do think that Torrey Holt's going to get his time because he was the number one receiver on the greatest show on turf. That team didn't last forever, but they played multiple seasons with Kurt Warner, who was bagging groceries before he showed up to quarterback that team and take over for Trent Green, who got injured right as the season was getting underway. And obviously Marshall Faulk was a big part of that team, but that was a moment in NFL history that people are going to remember. And I think that that's going to help him. Like, you got to be memorable, right? This is the Hall of Fame. It's not just numbers. If it was just numbers, this would be easy. But it's not just numbers. It's numbers, and it's how you are remembered. It's your legacy. And I think Torrey Holt's legacy is unmuddled, right? Like as I said with Reggie Wayne, well, which years were really the Marvin Harrison years where he was seeing the top cornerbacks across the league? Because let's be really honest, when you're seeing the number two cornerback on every team, if you are a number one quality wide receiver, like Reggie Wayne was, he is a Hall of Fame quality wide receiver. I mean, you got a lot of stats against guys who were less than you because you had Marvin freaking Harrison on the other side of the field. Torrey Holt didn't get that. He had great receivers on the other side of the field from him. Isaac Bruce was a great receiver. Oz Zahir Akeem was a great receiver, but they were not Torrey Holt. Torrey Holt was the number one receiver in that offense, and there was never a question about it. So, yeah, I think that his time is going to come, and I think similarly, all those guys' time is going to come at some point. Hopefully for Marshawn, as we talked about, when you think about Marshawn versus Frank Gore is memorable for his consistency. Marshawn is memorable for so much more when you think about the imprint that he had, the Skittles and all of those things. Like, Frank Gore doesn't have any of those things. He was just Frank Gore every year, and he was just there every year, grinding it out every year for the 49ers. So, all right, John, I feel great about this. I think that we've gotten down to a really solid two offensive inductees. We'll have to see if we're right about this once they go through the process and unveil the public announce. But we do have a bunch of defensive players to get through. We've got 5 spots on our list for defensive players across the line, the linebackers, and the secondary. As we discussed, we're not going to pick another special teams player. So just spoiler alert for all of you guys who tune into the next episode, that is not part of the plan to like really thoroughly discuss the special teamers and figure out if any of them have a place. They don't. Maybe Vinatieri does. We'll talk about Vinatieri, but that is all coming in our next episode. Can't thank you guys enough for making the time, and we'll be back at you shortly with episode 2, The Defenders.
Can't wait.
Cheers.